afternoon, everyone. Really good to be back with you again. And we're back. I'm back with really good friend and colleague, Fiorella Isabel. And we're going to try really hard not to completely destroy all the hopium that's floating around out there, particularly on social media. But we're going to try very hard to take a slightly different view on recent events and to try and just make sense of it. You don't have to agree with us, but we will perhaps go a little further, dig a little deeper, and I don't know, maybe you will agree, maybe you won't, but that's the whole point. We're just going to be putting ideas out there. And just to kick off, Fiorella, to some degree, we were vindicated fairly recently about what we were saying regarding the Russian-Iran strategic partnership. Do you just want to kick off with that?
Yeah. So just so you know, all of you, that we're not speaking just out of nothing. We base this on the knowledge that we have on the respective regions, but also looking a little bit deeper, as Vanessa said, than the outright headlines that you see or the outright statements, because there's always something that's happening up front, diplomatic relations of sort, that are always going to be framed positively by their respective governments, especially governments like Russia and China that are constantly pushing the UN Charter and constantly talking about diplomacy. Now, back, I think it was in February, we talked about this Russian-Iranian strategic military partnership. It was a treaty, the Iranian-Russian Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. That's what it was called. And in January, they signed this treaty, right? And it was ratified by the State Duma not too long ago. So I think it was ratified either early April or if not end of March, but it took some time to get ratified. Now, I talked about this with Vanessa before, but basically it was confirmed back on around April 9th, that the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Rudenko, he said that a U.S. attack on Iran would bring dire consequences for the region. And while Moscow would offer help in negotiations between Tehran and Washington, that they would not be obligated to aid Tehran in the event of an attack. And we had said this was different than the actual military strategic alliance that with North Korea that Russia had, that did include mutual intervention in case of an attack. And this was said, of course, in the fine print of the actual treaty that broke it down between Article 1, 2, 3, and had this various text about what that would it have within this agreement. And within the agreement with Tehran was that in the event that either contracting party was subject to aggression, the other contracting party shall not provide any military or other assistance to the aggressor, which would contribute to the continued aggression, or shall help to ensure that the differences have arisen and settled on the basis of the United Nations Charter and other applicable rules of international law. So that was something that went on. And the importance of all of this is essentially to mean that if Iran were to be attacked, they cannot count on Russia to do anything about it. And a lot of people had been pretty much, and have been for the longest time, signaling that there's some sort of ideological alliance between Russia, Iran, between the non-aligned axis, between China, that, all of these major countries, because of BRICS and because of multipolarity rising, that they're going to come together and combat the West and this ideological war and defeat the West. And this is why the West is sinking. Well, the West is sinking, yes. However, that doesn't mean that there is some sort of equity coming from all of this. And in fact, Vanessa, I actually went further with this recently in an interview. I basically have come to believe that what we're witnessing, and we can talk further about this, is with the normalization that we're seeing happen, right? And with the appeals from Saudi Arabia to Iran and from Iran and Russia, this sort of just diplomatic excitement and that the world is changing and all of this. I think what we're actually seeing is the fact that in spite of unilateralism, where the US just held all the power, we're going to see that power split, and not in the form of equity, but rather in the form of multinational powers that come from wealth. So what we're seeing is the international wealth take over against the people of these respective countries, which in a way is still the one world type of government. And I'm not saying, that Putin is evil or that Xi Jinping is evil, but what I am saying is that these multinational interests that the ruling class have much more in common internationally now with the age of globalization, with the age of the internet, than they have with the people, right? And I don't think it's as simplistic as we're just going to enter one world government where we don't have any say and everybody is equal, like they're all equally evil. But I do think that that's where we're headed, and that multipolarity is in essence a trap in some ways, but because people think it is something that it isn't, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think people see as effectively an anti-imperialist alternative to the paradigm that we've been existing under, which of course is US allied supremacy. But the reality, I think, is more likely to be not the eradication of US supremacy, but for it to be diluted with a kind of transnational, as you said, ruling class, oligarchy class that are going to be, to a large degree, controlling relations for mutual benefit. Now, my only proviso in that is, of course, we know the US doesn't like a win-win relationship at all. And while it maintains that win-lose concept or ideology, it's going to be, I don't quite see how, even now, how this is going to play out satisfactorily, let's say, to some kind of stability and security globally, because we're still, in my opinion, despite all the maneuvers that are going on, and we'll get onto those, we're still on a precipice. We're still heading towards some kind of final conflict. And I'm not quite sure how that can be resolved by these countries, assuming these countries, I'm talking Iran, China, Russia, assuming that they're playing on a level playing field. I think that's the danger for me. I don't necessarily have a major issue with there being, a trade relationship, an economic relationship, as long as there is security and balance, and as long as, and this is, again, another big question, the so-called global south, the countries that have been completely decimated by neocolonialism, by US supremacism, are able to develop and progress as sovereign nations. And that, of course, again, under any kind of US involvement, must come into question, right? And I think what is going on right now is, and this is the Trump effect, we've talked about this before, there's a lot of maneuvering going on. And I don't think any of it can be classed as conclusive evidence that countries are shifting towards one axis or another. I think each country at the moment is maneuvering and juggling and negotiating and trying to find some kind of national security stability. And I think to perceive it in any other way, for example, the recent Saudi visit to Iran, to perceive that as any kind of sign that that Saudi Arabia is moving away from the US and Israel, although it hasn't, of course, so far officially normalized. It's extremely unlikely for me that Saudi Arabia is going to move away from the US in particular, but also from Israel per se, because you can't disconnect the US from Israel. But I think what it is doing in its visit to Iran is protecting its own national security interests. Because if, for example, the US and Israel do escalate to a conflict with Iran, who's going to get hit? It will be the Gulf states. And number one in that is Saudi Arabia, because you also then have to bring in the situation in Yemen, Saudi's involvement in the destabilization of Yemen from pre-2015, of course, but starting officially in March 2015, the aggression against Ansarullah and the coalition government and the coalition resistance forces in Yemen. And so I think where I do have a problem is when people simplify what's going on by saying, oh, well, this is it. That's the end of Zionism. That's the end of Israel. You know what I mean? Because I don't think it's about that at all. I think this is right now, everyone is facing an existential threat. It's not just about diplomacy and maneuvering and engineering situations. It's literally everyone's facing annihilation right now. And I think what we're seeing is an attempt to mitigate the threat to their own security. I don't know how, whether you agree with that.
Yeah, so I first want to respond to what you're saying because I do agree with a lot of it by saying, well, it's not that the US or the West aren't losing power, but it is rather that as you said, that power will be more so spread out, right? And these countries have a decision to make, like Russia, Iran, China. They have a decision to make because any sort of, and I'm not against trade with the US or a normalization in terms of peace with the US. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is they need to, people also need to understand when we talk about Washington, who they are as a country, as an empire. And when we talk about terrorists, that people automatically assume we're talking about West Asia. But when I talk about terrorism, I'm talking about NATO. I'm talking about the United States, being the largest terrorist, as well as Zionists, right? Zionist Israel. And when we talk about that, you understand it's almost impossible to negotiate at a fair play. Because as you said, we know that the United States and Trump and this administration especially do not want to have a situation where they're giving up power. The problem is the world has shifted entirely in terms of the economic stability of, say, China. China is the US's biggest competitor, which is why you're seeing Trump put up this sort of bluff, like, oh, we're going to tax you, we're going to increase tariffs to 150%, we're going to do this and that. But the US is so reliant on China. And China, of course, also has a huge interwoven economic relationship with the US, but we know that it's not equal. We know that the United States heavily relies on China. We know that the United States would love to isolate China from Russia. And we do know that the United States seeks to continue having this sort of, I have my cake and I want my cake and to eat it too, in order to continue its economic dominance, in spite of the fact that that's no longer the case. That doesn't mean that China and Russia and even Iran are going to engage in an ideological fight to save Palestine and to save Gaza, because they could have done so a long time ago. They could have attacked Israel economically the same way Ansarullah is. They could have attacked Israel even militarily, put in some sort of their own sort of peace troops. And this is where people come in and they say, look, for example, well, China and Russia are not interventionists like the United States. But when we talk about what's happening in Gaza and the genocide, it is something that does require intervention because you're not going to stop Israel. And Israel is backed by the United States. So if you continuously still hold a relationship with the United States, you're in one way or another continuing to support Israel. And like Russia, if you continue to have a relationship with Israel, you're in one way or another taking a stance because they talk about neutrality and about being a neutral element in the region, but they are taking a stance. They are clearly taking a stance by not acting. And so there's different things here coming into play. There's the pragmatic economics of the world, as you said, acting in self-interest, especially Russia. And we've seen that recently, right? Not just with the Tehran strategic alliance, but also with their actions in Syria. And we are seeing those strategic, pragmatic interests come into play. Tehran, however, operates in a different way because you have, yes, a nation state, but you also have the resistance aspect. You have the ideological fight. And so with Tehran, I see a very huge decision to be made and a fight within in terms of where they're going, right? And I do think there needs to be a decision made, but from when I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at Russia and China in particular, I feel like that decision already has been made. Non-interventionism, neutrality, an attempt to continue some sort of economic relationship as the progression towards multipolarity, which just means a rise in power of the big ones. But it doesn't mean a rise in power in the global south, in my opinion. We're seeing it highlighted. We're seeing this highlighted, right? But is it changing? Not from where I'm looking at Latin America, what's happening there, not from when I'm looking at what's happening in Africa. There's a reliance now also on China and Russia for a lot of these countries, and this vulnerability that comes with that based on what we've seen happen to Syria, right?
Absolutely. And I think, I think also as the negotiations roll out between Russia and the US, again, it's also vindicating very much what we were saying from the beginning, from December last year when Damascus was finally overthrown by Al-Qaeda, backed really at that time predominantly by Turkey and Israel, who were collaborating on the final overthrow of Syria and the toppling of the Syrian government and the expulsion of Assad from inside Syria. Of course, he was taken out by Russia, and Russia played a role also in that final downfall. But I think what we're now seeing, particularly in Syria, we've talked about previously the collaboration now clearly between Russia and Israel. One, to enable Russia to remain inside Syria on the coast to consolidate its military presence, its naval and air-based presence on that coastal region where, of course, it already had from 2013 onwards, it had exclusive rights to exploit the natural gas off the coast of Syria. And then also to prevent the expansionism of Turkey. Now, again, this is something that Erdogan sold his involvement in the regime change war against Syria. He sold this idea that eventually this would have tremendous economic advantage for Turkey, and that, a lot of the electorate in Turkey accepted Turkey's role as a result, because they expected to see some kind of gain in the end when Turkish proxies would overrun Syria. And of course, that's just not happening. In fact, what is happening, it's becoming increasingly apparent that Turkey's going to have to pour more resources into Syria to just simply keep it afloat. And also we'll come on to, Jolani's own weak position now that he's had to expand outside Idlib, where he barely kept control. And he's now trying to control a Syria, which is effectively having pieces carved out of it from all directions, but we'll come on to that later. But what we're seeing now is further vindication of what we're saying, because not only has America removed from its conditions to lift the sanctions on Syria, it's removed the Russian evacuation from Syria. That's no longer being talked about, one. Two, I think I said on a couple of occasions that Trump wants the win of being seen to withdraw his troops from Syria, right? He already wanted it in his first administration, and it didn't work out for many reasons, partly because I think the UK then stage managed the 2017 alleged chemical weapon attack, which meant that the US had to keep its forces in Syria, right? That was a clash between UK power and US power at that point. And in fact, as a result, the troop presence from the United States was increased in northeast Syria. But now we're hearing effectively that the US is closing down 3 of its 8 bases in northeast Syria. And when I say 8 bases, there are actually more than that, but some of them are more established bases. Some of them are just basically, temporary outposts. And they're withdrawing 600 troops of the around 2,000 that they have, and they're talking about finally leaving less than 400. At the same time, Nabencia put out a statement in the UN saying that Russian military will remain at its positions. Now, I'm assuming he's not only talking about the coastal areas, but he's talking about the north, because Russia had quite a heavy presence west and east of the Euphrates. And I hadn't heard that those troops had been withdrawn. So I'm assuming he's talking about the fact that America is withdrawing its troops, Russia is keeping its troops in place, which is a very interesting development. And it again signifies that what happened in Syria was a much bigger power play, right? Everyone was moving their chess pieces around to a large degree in agreement. And this is a very important factor, because Syria, in a way, is a microcosm of what's going on in the world right now. So you have collaboration between Russia, Turkey, Israel, and the United States over Syria, effectively, right? You also have all of them wanting to exclude Iran from Syria. And that was always the goal and agenda of Russia, by the way. I mean, I remember speaking to intelligence officials in Syria from 2016 onwards, and they were always very clear that while they could accept Iran as a presence in Syria, it was a competitor, right? And so for me, it's very clear now what Russia is doing. It's seeing an opportunity to curb Turkish expansionism, to put Erdogan back in his place through collaboration with Israel. And, Turkey recently kind of probed to see what would happen if it talked about establishing air defense and military bases in central Syria and in Hama, which is just to the south of Idlib. And what happened? Within hours, Israel bombed the whole lot. I mean, Hama, I think, received something like 20 to 30 strikes. T4 in the center and Palmyra military air bases were completely decimated. I mean, they already had been immediately after Jolani took power in Damascus. So for me, it's very, very clear. These powers are consolidating their own security and power bases. And if that's in collaboration with Israel or with America, with Turkey, with Iran, doesn't matter. What's irrelevant for them is the fate of the Syrian people, the fate of the Palestinian people, right? This is what we're talking about. And I think people have this vision of multipolarity being all about sovereignty. Yes, it is all about sovereignty, but is it about sovereignty for the oppressed, for the tyrannized? No, I don't think so. I think it's about securing access to the resources in those countries. It's about securing control of those countries. And, Russia is looking to consolidate its presence in the western coastal areas of Syria. And as a result, it will have to do some degree of diplomacy. But we've also been seeing stories that Russia is collaborating with Jolani to evacuate the refugees from inside the Khamenei base, which is automatically going to mean that they're going to their death, because Alawites are being ethnically cleansed on an ever increasing level in these areas from Homs west and north, right? So this to me demonstrates that, yes, if it serves Russia's interests, it will provide safe haven in the sense that it will consolidate its presence in that western coastal area, and it will offer protection, and it will not want Jolani and his forces present in that area. So that will benefit the people, but that's not directly what they're trying to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on this. And look, it's not that we're trying to turn anybody against any of these countries. We're just telling people how this is, how this is happening, because I think there's a romanticized version of events that people have that they're not really seeing, right? Because there's also the fact that Russia has allegedly, according to this is actually according to TASS, because TASS actually talked about it as well. They are going to decriminalize Al Qaeda in the country, in
Taliban,
the Federation.
isn't it?
Is it the Taliban?
Yeah, it's the Taliban.
Yeah,
Yes.
let me see if I can pull up the article. They're going to decriminalize the Taliban. And here's the thing of the Taliban. Russia has suffered attacks from within the country and at the hands of these factions, right? And it's crazy to me, and I think to a lot of people, to a lot of Russians, that this would happen. But we also see the relationship with Jolani, and not only the transfer of oil, but also the quick ease into the relationship with the new Syrian regime. It was just so quick, and we talked about this when it happened, and we were like, gosh, that's actually quite odd that this is happening. I was just astounded by how quick it was happening, because I know you had been paying attention to Russia's role in Syria, but for most people, it was rather quick. And this sort of goes along with the Russian attachment to Israel as well. When Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump sat down and had a conversation, the question about Iran not having the ability to destroy Israel, that was something that they were in agreement. And that's the thing. And you talked about the competition factor between Iran and Russia and Syria. Well, that also points to, yes, there might be some sort of alliance strategically with Iran. That doesn't, but if this alliance doesn't have a military
mutual defense,
a military strengths, then it essentially it's just rendered a diplomatic feel-good type of symbolic alliance. Because when we're talking about the possibility of war with Tehran, this is in fact one of the last, I would say, bastions of a nation state having any sort of power in symbolic for Palestine, for Gaza. When we talk about Tehran, like, they are very much the resistance, right? And in many ways. And if that resistance as a nation state, where there is some ability of power, goes down, then the United States would have completed its goal of beyond the 7 countries in 5 years, because Lebanon, in many ways, has already been neutralized with the infiltrations within the government. A lot of people assume that Hezbollah is entirely in control, and that's just not the case. And so while resistance factions remain, and I'm not saying they're just gonna stand around and do nothing while the entirety of Gaza is decimated, while the West Bank is completely run over by Israel. I don't think that's going to happen. But in terms of powerful nation states that are actually trying to do something, Tehran is no longer there. And you have Yemen, a country, a nation of people so entirely decimated by war and bombing and sanctions, and just completely being terrorized by the West and Israel. It just leaves very little power in terms of geopolitical strength. And unfortunately, that's where I see this going. And I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, not taking a stance against Israel is taking a stance for Israel when it comes to Russia and China as well, because they have interfered in at times when they feel they should interfere. And this sort of Pontius Pilate thing, I mentioned this in an interview recently, and I just saw Sam Husseini wrote an article on this very topic, and I thought it was interesting because exactly is how I see these countries, these just completely just washing their hands and saying, yes, we condemn everything that's happening, we condemn all of the atrocities, but we seek some sort of two-state solution, which they both, Russia and China, both back, which is a ludicrous. It's not a solution. We know that that's not the solution. We know that it's not going to hold. Israel does not want that. They have never wanted it, and they clearly will not respect the existence of a Palestinian state as long as they're there. But we also know that Russia doesn't think Israel should be destroyed, right? Or in any way decimated. So what we're seeing here is, to me, it's not outright spoken. It's not outrightly said, but we're seeing that stance become very clear.
Yeah, I know, I totally agree. And I think also, just coming back to this Syria, Russia situation, I think the recent visit of the foreign minister from Iran, who brought a letter from Imam Khamenei to Putin, but also I think prior to that, the Emir of Qatar also came to Russia. And I think, everyone now, like if you like, Russia is coming to the forefront again in Syria and in the region. And I think a lot of this is, if it's a letter from Khamenei, who is far more, let's say, resolute in the resistance against US interference and intervention, then, it's very hard to speculate on what was included in that letter. But certainly from the visit of the Emir of Qatar, I would say that this is definitely on behalf of Turkey, because we have to remember that Qatar and Turkey saw the huge advantage in the toppling of Assad. Assad rejected the Qatari-Turkish pipeline for the Iranian-Russian pipeline in the very beginning in 2009. I think he finally turned it down. And of course, that then turned into the regime change war. So I think this is about trying to basically secure Qatari Turkish interests, Muslim Brotherhood interests in Syria through Russia. And of course, Russia, they see Russia getting closer to Israel, right? So this is what I'm saying, like everyone is vying for position and influence and consolidation of power and resources. That's what I see going on. As regards Khamenei's letter to Putin, no, there is potential there that it is trying to launch some kind of defense conversation, mutual defense conversation. But now I'm really speculating. I honestly, I really don't know. And I would say that The Saudi visit to Tehran, as I've said, is very much about self-preservation. What is interesting is when we look at the statements, so Saudi Arabia is saying basically engagement with Iran is now seen as a cornerstone of regional security cooperation and greater prosperity. So in other words, I think probably what they were trying to do is to do a deal with Iran to preserve their own oil industry in the case of any kind of conflict. And yet Khamenei said, basically, Iran is ready to assist in various fields where I think he said Iran has made big achievements. Now, that could be interpreted as development of some kind of nuclear energy. I'm not going to go down the kind of nuclear, capability route. And he says it's far better for brothers in the region to cooperate and assist each other than rely on others. So he's also putting out a very clear message. He's basically saying, we shouldn't be fighting because, of course, Saudi is seen as the head of the Sunni Muslim populations in the region, and Iran is seen as the head of the Shia Muslim. And each of them have been vying for power and influence in the region for decades. This is again another conflict that within the conflict in Syria. So Khamenei is trying, actually, in my opinion, to say let's end these decades of fitna, of division between us, because it's being exploited by the West and by Israel to divide us, to weaken us, to make us vulnerable. But I'm not sure that Saudi Arabia is seeing it in the same way, right? That I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And I think while Trump is now backing off on the statement that he apparently made, saying that he was walking back on the war with Iran, he's now walking back on that statement and saying, well, I didn't really say that, but, I'm saying that we'll wait for the negotiations. And of course, what is America doing? It's putting Iran, as it always does, into a position where eventually it's going to be seen as the one obstructing any kind of deal, right? That's what they do. That's the tactic. But I think for Israel, the better alternative, in their opinion, and I've been seeing a lot of statements and reports in Hebrew media about this, kind of floating the idea of civil strife and regime change in Iran. Right. So I think there's two branches at the moment of the aggression against Iran. One is the direct aggression that Trump is often talking up and threatening in a kind of ridiculous bully boy way. But on the other side, they're working on fomenting internal civil strife. They're talking about water shortages. They're talking about all the things that can engender civil unrest inside Iran, right? So there's two strains of attack against Iran ongoing at the moment. And of course, the third, if you want, is the attack on Yemen itself, which is to a degree demonstrating US-Israeli alliance and strength. I mean, of course, it isn't really, because they're actually not doing as much damage as the cost of what they're doing effectively, which is fairly standard. I mean, Israel has spent billions in trying to destroy Hamas, and it's still receiving rockets on a daily basis from the Qassam brigades, right? But I think the positioning of the Navy, the fact that the new aircraft carrier is now basically parked north of Socotra, so very close to the Straits of Hormuz, this is all about intimidation. And this is all about sort of saying, look, we're going to destroy all of your proxies. I'm using US and Israeli language now. It's not my language, right? We're going to destroy all of your resistance axis one by one. Syria has fallen, which was of course it was a massive blow. I'm not saying it was a mortal blow, but it was a massive blow to the entire resistance axis. We've separated all of the resistance factions. We're working on Iraq now. They're obviously working, and they're working on the rumor mill that they're all going to basically be disarmed. They're working on getting Hezbollah disarmed and integrated into the Lebanese military. None of this is really going to work, but you can see where it's heading, right? And eventually they want Iran to be isolated. That's what they're working on. And then in my opinion, to bring in this regime change strategy through multi-spectrum hybrid war tactics. Sorry, that was a very long.
No, like I all of this takes a long time to explain because, well, I think Saudi Arabia, and maybe I'm just being too dark here, but I do think Saudi Arabia, while also looking at its own interests, is also being pushed by the United States to attempt to bring in Iran. And I do think it is mainly for regime change, because regime change in Iran would benefit the main players here. It would benefit Israel. It would benefit Saudi Arabia. It would benefit the United States. And regime change with Iran would also be in ways I think people don't expect or like to hear, welcomed by Russia, because they would see it as an end to a quagmire that they have in the relations with Iran and Israel. I don't think they would outright say it, but I do think that they actually hate conflict as a government, and they are looking to establish some sort of, trade relations with everybody to increase their economic capacity and to continue their progress and growth in the region as well. And so I think regime change would benefit all of these players immensely. And it would just make it so there is a sense of stability. However, I again, we go back to, is that possible when there are so many chefs in the kitchen? I don't think so. I think that something will have to happen. But I do think this administration's goal set out by the intelligence apparatus is to confront Iran, is to confront China, and to end the Eurasian situation between Russia, Ukraine. But I under no circumstances think Saudi Arabia is just there because they will unite under this Arab unity type of thing, and that they're going to take on the Zionists of Israel together. There is no actual indication of that happening. Saudi Arabia still maintains a relationship with the United States and Israel both. They will not leave that relationship because they see it as a beneficial relationship, an economic one. And if there were ever a moment where they would see an end to that relationship, then sure, they would shift to the other side. But there isn't anything happening powerful enough to suggest that they are shifting. Any diplomatic talks, and Saudi Arabia said they welcome Iran's talks with the nuclear talks with the United States. So okay, that also says to me that they want some sort of agreement. They want some sort of compliance from Iran to have these talks, right? They want Iran to sit down with the United States. This is all part of that. But Iran cannot trust the United States. I mean, that's the fact that I have to say this is insane to me. The same way I've said Russia cannot trust the United States, because this administration, sure, that's their role, but the next, I feel like a lot of these things, these situations are getting kicked down the road. They're not going away. I don't think the desire from NATO to balkanize Russia is going to go away. I think they're waiting. And right now the appearance is to try to quote unquote end the war, but I don't think the desire to continue their attack on Russia is going to wane, mainly because of the natural resources that are there. And it's such a vast territory that unfortunately, according to history, that's just, especially as we continue advancing and the entire world is getting smaller and smaller, it's not going to it's not going to last. And there's going to there will be, I think, another return to that. But right now, I do see what you see in terms of the regime change aspect, because Donald Trump has been pushing this idea that Hamas and Hezbollah and Ansarullah and Palestinian protesters and college campuses are all connected
Yeah,
to Tehran in one way or another. He is
yeah.
also pushing the fact that immigrants coming in are also connected to, communist China, communist Venezuela, and also to Iran, and that the potential for weapons smuggling into U.S. domestic territory in order to push out some sort of attack against the United States is also a possibility. So he's tying all of this together, and that's done for a purpose. It's
Yeah.
done so there is a manufacturing of consent for war. I don't put the U.S. Past engaging in some sort of false flag attack, sure, but I think they will try regime change first. And I think that that's what they're doing. It's better economically for them, and it will just be an easier transition. And Saudi Arabia has also been listed as the go-to for the Israeli Greater Israel Plan that we have seen. It was laid out before us, saying that they will use Saudi Arabia and the Gulf to isolate Iran, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think that goal has changed. I think that goal is right in play, and they can display all of this diplomatic unity, and people can cheerlead and say, "Yay!" There's this. They're uniting against Zionist Israel, but I don't see how you get that out of what we're looking at here.
Well, and also I would remind people that exactly the same thing happened in the couple of years before the final downfall of the government and leadership in Syria. UAE and Saudi Arabia were very much used in a very similar way to come in as a Trojan horse, offer humanitarian relief, which never materialized, by the way. Basically they were kind of the vanguard to try and persuade Assad to come over to the normalization with Israel. And that, too, as I've said also before, was also, in my opinion, being pushed by Russia, because they wanted to disconnect Syria and Assad from the resistance axis, because, as you said, they didn't want to get stuck in this quagmire, and because ultimately they will protect the security of Israel in the region. That is a red line for Russia. And, I've heard that even here from within the resistance factions here. They're well aware of, what Russia is as regards being a pragmatic player in the region, not ideologically connected to the resistance in any way. But if it serves its interests, it might help out every now and then. That's very much how they see it here, in a very kind of clear way. And so therefore it's no surprise to them that Putin in particular was kind of pushing and pressuring Assad to go back to the Arab League, to re-affiliate with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And of course, that would automatically mean heading towards the Abraham Accords and normalization with Israel. And so therefore, I kind of see the same gameplay going on here, although I do think that Saudi Arabia itself does face, real existential risk with any kind of increase in conflict between Israel and Iran. So I think there's two factors here. I think America, again, is deploying Saudi Arabia to try and bring Iran round. And, we also can't forget Imam Khamenei is, I can't remember how old he is now, but I think he's in his 80s. And being absolutely cynical, they know, let's face it, President Raisi, who was very much marked as the successor to Khamenei, was killed. Whether it's deliberate or not, I guess we'll never know. But in my opinion, it was an assassination. And that was deliberate, so that there would be no successor to Imam Khamenei, who would continue the resistance ideology, right? And so what I think they want to do is to cut off the heads of the resistance. Iran is factions within Iran are never going to abandon the resistance. But what do they then do? It ceases to be a state resistance country, right? It ceases to be a state as part of the resistance axis. And in theory, they want it also to be at a point where it's no longer going to support the resistance itself. So it's no longer going to support Yemen. It's no longer going to support Iraq or Lebanon or even Syria, where, you know, there are resistance factions now coming to light, which was inevitable. So that's, for me, that's the clear plan here. And Saudi Arabia, as you said, is always a carrier pigeon in this in this scenario. And I think, you know, people would do well to remember what happened in Syria, and the role that Saudi Arabia played there. And I hope that Iran is also paying attention to that, because of course what we see is the language of diplomacy, right? We don't actually see what goes on behind the scenes or the discussions that go on. And Khamenei has been pretty tough recently, as was al-Houthi, of course, the leader of Ansarullah, put out an incredibly strong statement. I think it was yesterday or the day before. And actually, what was quite remarkable about that statement, he was actually talking about Lebanon and Hezbollah and actually issuing instructions to some degree. So I think the leadership of the resistance axis to some degree has shifted to Yemen and shifted to Ansarullah when I see the statement that was put out, because he covered every single country within the resistance axis, including Algeria. So I found it, and it was one of his longest speeches and one of the most powerful ones. And he's never, ever interfered in Hezbollah policy before, but he was effectively saying, you know, he was, it was an advisory statement to them. And that's a complete change in policy. So I think there has been discussions, and I think Ansarullah and Houthi now will pick up the leadership of the resistance, which indicates to me that the resistance is taking steps to ensure that it can exist, whatever happens. That's my reading of it.
Wow, that's yeah, I actually hadn't thought about it that way, but that's actually, you know, I've been seeing so much action and so much come from Yemen recently that it would make sense. And I also just wanted to remind people that the if you recall the Iranian and the Saudi officials meeting in 2023 in Beijing, that's what signaled the first talks, right? In a long time, that signaled that in essence to try to have some sort of diplomatic and restore this diplomatic and security cooperation agreement. And it was interesting because Iraq and Oman and the Chinese were involved in that. But when we look at China again, just like Russia, they're always involved as neutral actors in trying to restore some sort of diplomatic scenario. But what people need to understand is it's not because they simply are just ideologically acting for the greater good of humanity and peace, but because they have interests that are there. And so I think when we analyze things, we need to look at the interests that these countries have. And I think, you know, the resistance, I they're also clearly looking at that. I think that the fall of Syria signaled to many what is possible and who is reliable and who isn't, and very few have clearly been reliable in this fight, because I don't think that the top priority of any of these countries, whether it's the United States, Russia, China, is the Palestinian people or stopping the genocide or any of that. That's clearly not the priority. Even if in the countries that people, have praised as being multipolarity leadership, that's clearly not their priority. Their priority is, as you said, their self-interest and ensuring their survival. And at an age where we are now, where there's a potential for nuclear war, and people are discussing, well, does Iran have the ability to have nuclear weapons and blah blah blah. For me, that's a clear answer. If the United States has that ability, if Israel has that ability, if XYZ country has that ability, then why not Iran? That's to me, it's just a moot point. It's all, the nuclear weapons are already there. The potential for war is already there. But I think, people have gotten so used to discussing nuclear war, that they've not really paid attention to what's happening is the soft power negotiations behind the scenes. These sort of conversations that are happening to normalize relations, but really, to me, it's just kind of putting the issues under the carpet. They're still there. They're not going away. And I do think we are due for an actual war, but I think there are efforts to sort of work it out in what is outright being put as cooperation, but to me, it's just ignoring it. It's just ignoring the resolution. The big truth is that Israel is a huge, just warmongering issue, a dynamite waiting to explode constantly in the region. And until the Israeli issue is dealt with, and that in dealing with that issue, they have to deal with the United States. Until that issue is dealt with, there will not be peace in the region, because as long as some sort of resistance faction exists, that they will always fight. They have an ideological fight within them. They are driven by the greater desire to defeat Zionism, this fight that is an ideological one. It is a righteous fight, of course, but in the world of geopolitics and these calculated chess moves, it is something that is disruptive to those that are looking to simply just, okay, well, we're just going to move along, and have these normal relationships and cooperate and become very civilized and evolve, and I just hate how that's being painted as, oh, the resistance doesn't want peace. Oh, the resistance wants to continue fighting. Why don't you become more civilized like the Gulf states, when we know very well those are the states that have completely been subjugated to the West, that have been completely complicit in that type of foreign policy, and that have thrown Palestinians under the bus, that have thrown Syrians under the bus, and Ansarullah and the people of Yemen under the bus, in an effort to promote this false peace. And I hate nothing more than this false sense of pacifism that is coming from this, because it's fake. It's not real. If we were to achieve a genuine peace that was based on actual respect, on actual sovereignty of all people, even the ones that don't hold nuclear weapons, even the nations that are not powerful in the sense of economic prosperity or in the sense of having geopolitical prowess, I think then, yes, I would respect that. But right now, what I'm seeing is the brouhaha of just backed by nothing. And I find that incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. I think, as Martin Luther King said, the white moderate, I mean, he was talking about whites, of course, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. And that, I think, is, in a nutshell, what we're facing again. And I just want to make the point as well, I've been making it quite a bit recently, is that we talk about Israel, and many people, even within the resistance axis, talk about Yes, but Israel's going to implode. It's facing its own kind of internal civil strife, and it is economically, it is suffering, and it is kept on life support by the US alliance, which includes, of course, the UK and the EU. But ultimately, what is Israel? It's the spear tip of the Zionist movement globally. And I think, I want to end by making a connection here, because we talk about the resistance regionally, and I know a lot of people in the West kind of disconnect to it because they see it as an Islamic resistance. They see it as something thousands of miles away that isn't going to affect them. They stand in solidarity with the Palestinian cause. They stand against genocide. But I think what people really don't understand is the Zionist movement is already embedded in the West. It's already controlling almost every single sector of society and culture and civilization in the West, including health and education and surveillance and security and military and so on. It's in control of everything, pharmaceutical, the whole lot, right? And Israel is just the tip of this Zionist iceberg.
Yeah.
And so what the resistance is doing is what every single person should be doing, which is combating this power base, which is driving everything. It's driving the wars, it's driving the economic wars, it's driving everything that is destroying the world right now, because the greatest effect, even on environmental issues in the world today, is the military-industrial complex. And if we go nuclear, then forget it. It's finished. The world is over as we know it, right? So I think rather than having this disconnect with the resistance in West Asia, there should be a connect, because the values that they are upholding are not only Islamic, they're the values of humanity. They're the values of what it means to be a human being, to stand against tyranny and oppression, and to stand for sovereignty and the development of all countries in the world, as you said, not just the big ones, all of them. And every country benefiting from its resources without those resources being plundered and abused, as they have been for centuries. And this is what we should be working for. And I can categorically say that the big countries are not going to be working towards that, in my opinion. And that is what we should be aware of. There's no equality in this so-called multipolar paradigm that is being offered to us as an alternative. There's no equality there. There will still be the same resource theft. It will just be done in a more subtle way. This is my opinion, right? China, well, yes, you can hold up examples of how China runs its own country, but that's its own country.
Right. Right. Yeah. China has lifted its people out of poverty. It's done very well for itself and for its people. Russia, in a lot of ways, has also done that for its people. That doesn't mean that they're going to fight other, more ideological fights. And I think, people will say, well, how can you expect them to, right? How can you, Russia's fighting a war right now. But
Yemen is
China's focused on fighting a tariff. But exactly. So it is because it is required in this sense. We're talking about a genocide. Everybody else went to war for multiple reasons during the Second World War, right? People eventually did get involved but it was until they faced the danger themselves. Right. Yeah. That's the difference. When this is why, for me, what's happening now is far worse than what happened during World War II, because Israel has turned itself into an enemy that cannot be attacked. And it's not Israel. Israel's a representation of the Zionism, right? And we can't attack Zionism because we're anti-Semitic. We still have people who still preach the existence of Israel. The other day I said something like Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself because it's not real. It doesn't have a right to exist. It is completely defined even by the weakest international law as an invader. It is not even a real nation state. It was put there. And so when you say something like that, people are like, well, you're just ruining the cause for the Palestinians. It's like, no, this is actually the truth. And the fact that it is now criminal to say that in the United States. It is, you will be, your life could be ruined, and not just in the United States, but in all of the West. And who knows if you can get away with it, even saying that in Russia, because like they're just, the Zionism is everywhere, and and it is exactly a fascistic ideology. Just because they've used the mantle of Judaism to get away with it all does not mean that it is not a fascistic ideology. It has the same elements of fascism in terms of an ideology that Nazism has. And when you say these things, people are like, how can you say that? And it could be it is Zionism just as well as Christian Zionism. It is that type of mentality that I think needs to be combated, because it is spread, as you said, it is spread everywhere. And the worst part is, when it was Nazism, we were able to look at what was done and fight it. And it was obviously bad, but it was also in Europe. And this is also happening in West Asia, where Europeans in the West have been led to believe it's because of who they are as people, because Arab people are always fighting amongst each other. They're always having sectarian wars. This is, these people, they're always fighting over religion. This is what in the West you're told. This is what I hear all the time, right? When I'm over there. And so it is that mentality that has allowed us to just endure this genocide and continue enduring more genocides, and in Israel attacking multiple countries in one day. I mean, it's just, it's baffling, but people still make a difference when, for example, if we were to hear, oh, Hamas just bombed, an entire city, the entire city of Tel Aviv. If we were to hear that, if that was to be on any sort of social media platform, on any sort of news channel, the entire world would just halt. And and who knows what would happen. But it happens pretty much every day, Israel doing that, to whether it's Gazans, whether it's people in the West Bank, whether it's in Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon, it doesn't matter, Yemen. Every single day we hear that Israel has done something, and we've become so complacent. And I think when we talk about combating Zionism, that needs to be at the forefront, that it's not just Israel, and it's not just the United States anymore. It is the entire world that is affected by it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good note to end on, Faye, because we've been talking for an hour and a half now. So apologies to people. But I hope you enjoyed listening to our discussion. As I said, we just try to unravel everything as completely as possible, and looking at it from all sides rather than from an ideological position, except of course resistance is an ideology, and resistance against tyranny and a lack of equality and a lack of true freedom for sovereign nations to make their own decisions and to benefit from their own resources, and to exist in this world on an equal footing with the big guys. I think that is an ideology that I would lay claim to. But Bea, really, thank you so much for taking the time again. I know that you're really busy. Can you let people know where they can find your work?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. As you always say, it's cathartic to speak with you, and I hope that people listen to some of our rant today because we just hadn't met in a while, so
Yeah.
we wanted to make it happen. So you can all find me at Fiorella Isabel M at in on X/Twitter, and you can find me Fiorella in Moscow on Telegram, and also Fiorella Isabel on Substack, where I have some things coming up. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Fee. Take care and speak to you again very soon because there's a lot of developments going on right now. Take care.
Okay, bye.